Hello, everyone. Good morning from Singapore, good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Arif Jamal. I'm the Deputy Director of the Center for Asian Legal Studies at the Faculty of Law at the National University of Singapore. And on behalf of the center, on behalf of CALS, as we call it, I'd like to welcome all of you here to today's webinar and express our thanks to the panelists in particular for agreeing to participate in today's session. It's also a pleasure for us to collaborate with ICOMOS Singapore to address the issue of the impact of COVID-19 on heritage law and protection, which is a topic which is both timely and important. With those few words, it's my pleasure to hand you over to the very capable hands of the moderator today, Dr. Kevin Tan, who will take us forward and introduce the speakers and manage the session. Kevin, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Arif, and good morning, afternoon, evening to everyone who has joined us. Welcome to yet another series of our virtual roundtables in Asian law. My name is Kevin Tan. I teach at the National University of Singapore. And I also am the immediate past president of ICOMOS Singapore, the International Council on Monuments and Sites, the Singapore National Committee. It's great that I am able to moderate at this session where I have a couple of my ICOMOS colleagues, Paulius and Jack, as well as Montira from UNESCO, whom ICOMOS works very closely with on matters of heritage protection and conservation. So what we will do for this session is I will first introduce our three speakers, invite them each to speak in turn. Paul will go first, followed by Montira, and then Jack will wrap up at the end. In the meantime, there is a Q&A panel. If you go to the bottom of the screen, you can see the Q&A option. Now that allows you, the audience, to type in questions that you may have during the course of presentation, and they will then be collected by me. And what we will do is have these questions dealt with and answered or discussed at the end of the three presentations. So what will happen is that I will maybe group some questions together, and if there are questions that are general, you may just say it's posed to the panel in general. Otherwise, you may want to direct questions to individual speakers on points that they may have made. So please use that and keep the questions coming so that at the end of the three presentations, we can have sort of questions and discussions going all around. So let me now very briefly introduce to you our speakers for today in the order of presentation. Our first speaker will be Paulius Jurcys. He is Deputy Chairman of Lithuania ICOMOS and co-founder of a company called Profina, right, which deals with areas of copyright law, data privacy, commercialization of intellectual property. He was recently in charge of a major survey done by ICOMOS on the impact of COVID-19 on heritage protection. So he will be talking about that. Our second speaker is Montira Unakul. She is a cultural program officer of UNESCO in Bangkok, and she has managed various UNESCO programs within the Asia Pacific region relating to the safeguarding and sustainable development of cultural heritage with a focus on world heritage. And our final speaker is Jack Lee. Jack is an old colleague of mine and works with me at ICOMOS as well. Jack is currently president of the Singapore Heritage Society, another NGO in Singapore that is very much concerned with heritage protection. He is also Singapore's leading heritage law expert, and so he will focus his talk about the impact of COVID pandemics generally, and I think Jack is preparing a chapter for a handbook on pandemics and heritage law. So with that, let me turn the floor over to Paul. You have the floor for now.
Hi, everyone. So I would like to share the screen. I hope you can see it with me already. Okay, good. So in this very short presentation of mine, I will share some of the insights that we have been able to collect in the past couple of months with regard to the survey we have conducted with the president of ICOMOS, as well as some colleagues who were appointed to the COVID-19 task force. So let me begin by giving a very first background information, how we came up with this idea. In May, Professor Kono, who is the president, together with Mr. Landa, they wrote a statement from ICOMOS highlighting the importance of COVID and the possible implications to heritage. So this first statement highlighted some important themes that will probably be impacting the future of heritage. And one of the core messages was that this pandemic is not really going to end soon. So we have to think in the longer term perspective and see what can be done to address a number of issues that are going to emerge. So there was this initial statement, after which a special task force group was created. There are 5 emerging professionals who are doing the heavy lift in this group, and we are guided by the president as well as the board members of ICOMOS. In terms of methodology, we started by reviewing the previous studies, surveys, and various statements that have been made in the context of heritage broadly. We identified that there were probably 10 or so attempts to gather information about the impact of COVID to various cultural activities. And we figured out that most of the focus was on the activities of museums and culture. So there was clearly a gap in terms of focus on heritage. Then we discussed a lot and we identified some of the themes that are really relevant in terms of COVID and heritage, and we drafted the questionnaire. So the questionnaire aims to actually gather as much information as possible from national committees of ICOMOS. So the respondents of the questionnaire at this initial stage have been national committees specifically. We directed the questionnaire to NCs, mainly because we believe that as an organization uniting professionals in heritage, we will be probably getting the most accurate and most up-to-date information. So far we have received 32 responses from different continents. Unfortunately, there are slightly fewer responses from the Americas, but we are working hard to get some information. So 32 responses is not too much, but also we actually have a very nice distribution in terms of continents, cultures, and regions. In the questionnaire, so I will go back. In the questionnaire, we identified some of the main themes that have to be addressed. So tangible heritage, intangible heritage, natural heritage. Then we are trying to explore how COVID affects the community activities and interaction with local heritage sites and objects. And we also try to extract some information, what measures have local government agencies, communities, and national committees have taken in order to deal with various problems. And we also asked the respondents to suggest some of the actions that ICOMOS internationally could take in the next months and years probably to come. So let's briefly address some of the key themes that were addressed by national committees, and I will outline some of the main ideas and concepts that have been brought by national committees. So when we talk about tangible heritage, most of the committees agreed that, or most of the respondents agreed that obviously COVID had significant impact on tangible heritage and the heritage sites. And this was mainly caused by two reasons. First, obviously there was a decrease of international tourism, which affected how sites are managed, how many tourists are coming to sites, how much funds are being collected to maintain the sites, and so on. The second important reason or important factor that affected heritage was related to budget costs. So basically many countries have reported that the government had reduced the funding for heritage sites, which in turn affected the staffing and maintenance and the monitoring. So this was probably quite obvious also in Singapore and other Asian regions. As a result of cutting costs and decrease of tourism, we could see that a number of projects have been either stayed or delayed. And as I mentioned already, there was a huge impact of resources allocated for human capital and human resources in charge of handling situations locally. I think I can probably in the discussion address some of the cases related to tangible heritage, but one of the big themes we have noticed was that there was a lot of significance given to the digital media and how local heritage sites and the bodies in charge of local heritage sites have tried to implement digital tools, digital means to facilitate people interact with heritage. And of course, you can guess that there were many webinars, seminars, activities, events online. And I would like to mention one negative, actually, fact or negative case, which was noticed in some European countries, where various development projects have been moved to online space, which meant that local communities that were supposed to express their concerns about proposed development projects were actually not able to interact and express their views simply because the manager of Zoom calls was not giving opportunities that would be otherwise available, where communities come with developers in one physical space, in conference hall and so on. So that was an interesting fact. Let's move quickly now to intangible heritage. When we talk about intangible, we can see that obviously most of the events in all countries have been canceled, which led to many different implications. So some of the events have moved to the digital space, which in turn meant that even though we can notice more people attending online events, actually many respondents noted that this was also negative in the way that there was loss of authenticity and in-person communication. So some challenges related to transmission of living heritage and authenticity were frequently mentioned. From the social point of view, obviously when festivals and events move to digital space, there is this missing spontaneity and experience that would be otherwise available while being on site. From economic point of view, many artists, creators, and local heritage communities were not really able to benefit from presence and being able to distribute and sell their artifacts and objects that they're making. What are the medium and long-term impact of COVID to intangible heritage? We will have to see. And I think this is ongoing process, but I think again, the buzzword here is authenticity and how COVID will affect the human interaction and this transition towards new paradigm we will have to see in the future. Let's move to the third segment of heritage that was subject of the survey, natural heritage. Very briefly, I can mention that there were positive impacts to natural heritage caused by COVID and negative impacts. So on the positive side, we can see that there was a reduction of pollution, which in turn facilitated the preservation of sites and biodiversity. It also led to increased local tourism. So instead of having huge crowds of people coming from abroad, people who are resident in the neighborhoods or in the same country were traveling locally and exploring their local natural heritage sites. On the darker side, we can see that the reduction of costs from the financial side, from the state governments to local heritage sites, led that there was no monitoring of those natural heritage sites, which in turn led to some unfortunate incidents of poaching in African regions, or destroying or incidents where some local heritage sites have been negatively affected, mainly destroyed. Let's move now to the impact on local communities by COVID. We can see that, again, there is big transition from live communication, live interaction to online space. In addition to what I mentioned already before, we can identify some of the reasons why this movement towards the digital space actually has been very rapid and quite overwhelming. First of all, families that had young kids at home, they had to find the new content to share and teach kids. So topics and subjects related to heritage were quite attractive. But also there was like overwhelmingly perceived the need to preserve heritage and traditions. So we can see that many stakeholders got involved, both government agencies, museums, as well as private communities, local communities, and stakeholders, volunteers. They started to get involved and create content. So some examples were, for example, in China, there is a tomb sweeping day, which usually means that people would go to the cemeteries and take care of the relatives' gravestones, graveyards, but now everything happened online, and many other examples. And if I can conclude, I will mention two more topics. In terms of response measures, what different countries have taken. So in front of you, you can see a list of most frequently mentioned measures that have been taken. So obviously, social distancing and COVID-related sanitation measures have been implemented. A lot of activities have been related to moving towards digital space. But also we can see that there were examples of countries trying to provide some support to local creators and communities to help them keep their traditions and somehow help to cope with the implications of COVID. And the final slide, in terms of what suggestions local committees gave to international ICOMOS. Of course, we received a lot of different proposals, but if I could summarize in brief, first, the main theme was that more information could be shared, more knowledge could be shared within heritage expert community. There were some suggestions made that more surveys, more empirical studies should be conducted during this time in terms of facing this new challenge raised by COVID. There were proposals that regional and international cooperation ties and bonds could be promoted. So that is very high level overview. And if you have some questions and feedback, we would be more than grateful to hear that. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Paul. That was a great summary, and it's a bit disappointing that only 38 national committees have actually responded to the survey. So let's hope that when the survey comes in, more survey results come in, that some of the more negative results are somehow ameliorated. Let me now invite Montira Unakul to do her presentation. She will speak about disruptions and implications of the pandemic for legal and regulatory reform. Montira, floor is yours.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much once again to ICOMOS Singapore and to CALS for inviting me to take part in this event. As you know, UNESCO has been carrying out a number of events, both worldwide as well as at the regional level and at the local level, to dig deeper into some of the impacts from the pandemic. And very much along the lines of what Paulius has shared with us just now. And I'd like to think, perhaps take the next step and then think about, so now we know what these problems are, and there are recommendations that are emerging, and sort of what lies beyond the horizon in terms of how we should be rethinking what to do in terms of cultural heritage management and cultural heritage governance. And so many people have seen in the news that one of the negative implications that has arisen from the lockdowns, the budget cuts, and the general sort of shrinkage in terms of capacity throughout heritage governance has been that the cultural heritage sites have suffered, for instance, not only neglect, but also in some cases active incidents such as looting. And Paulius made mention of this earlier as well. So we had in the middle of this summer, a number of Bagan pagodas being looted, and many people will remember that Bagan was listed as a World Heritage Site last year. And normally, within the first year of World Heritage listing, you see this enormous ramp up in terms of development, but also tourism. But in this case, Bagan was empty, along with many other heritage sites around the world. UNESCO World Heritage Center did a survey, and 90% of World Heritage sites were closed or inaccessible at one point earlier this year. And it's not only the cultural heritage, but also the natural heritage sites that have been suffering as well, with communities going hungry or reductions in monitoring and other types of on-the-ground presence. We have seen that the incidents of poaching, either by maybe local perpetrators or perhaps by more organized, larger forces, have in fact reared their heads. And this has been an issue, not just in the example that I'm showing you here from South Asia, but literally from around the world. And so the question is, are these incidents a manifestation of the failure of law enforcement as such? Paulius made mention of the fact that, you know, many heritage authorities have seen budget cuts. People have been unable to access the sites. People have been unable to really keep in control maybe local communities who are literally going hungry and maybe have to turn to illicit activities in order to make ends meet. And so is this really the way that we can understand this phenomenon? Or on the other hand, as with many of these discussions with COVID, do we see these activities as a manifestation of maybe more structural issues in terms of heritage governance? And so much has been said about the fact that many heritage sites rely primarily on tourism as their primary source of income. And so this failure to distribute risk, which, you know, would be normal under normal market circumstances, is not what you see at heritage sites, which in fact put all their eggs in one basket, and that basket is the tourism basket. And so this over-reliance on tourism and a few other income sources means that when this tourism is disrupted, then of course, you know, everything goes by the wayside, not just the heritage management, but also the livelihoods of local communities and local people and local businessmen as well. And so this is an issue that has been discussed a lot. And I think the tourism industry is all about kind of getting back on track with domestic tourism in the short run, and then trying to win back long-haul visitors in the longer term. But I think there are a lot of people now beginning to discuss whether, in fact, we need to just change our model of local development at heritage sites and find opportunities beyond tourism. There are a lot of economies where they're much more diversified. And even if they do have heritage sites like Paris, for instance, which is a major tourism magnet, you wouldn't say that tourism, would account for such an outsized part of the Parisian economy that, there would be a total collapse. And so this is an opportunity to reskill and upskill in various areas as well. Secondly, there's also the more fundamental model of heritage management, which in many cases, at least in Asia, there's still a reliance on a state-centric approach. So the government is still the primary authority in charge. It wields the laws, it has the authority, it has the budget, and it has the mandate to take care of heritage. And it relies very much on technocratic know-how in the hands of bureaucrats to enforce heritage protection. And as a result, many of the laws that are in place and many of the heritage management mechanisms that are in place end up disempowering customary guardians who live at the sites and who have had, in many cases, generations upon generations of responsibility for taking care of those sites. And this has, continued to be a source of friction. And many sites, including even World Heritage sites or potential World Heritage sites, see this friction played out on the international stage, where we have customary guardians clashing with, the forest authorities or the cultural heritage authorities, and they don't see, a way out together. Another issue related to this is that many heritage agencies are overstretched, and we often hear complaints that we don't have enough money, we don't have enough people, we don't have enough resources. And when you look at the way that these heritage agencies are set up, whether they're departments of archaeology or departments of fine arts or ministries of culture, you see that almost to a T within Asia, heritage agencies are both operators as well as regulators, which means to say that they themselves are going out and doing the archaeological excavations and doing the conservation work on monuments and so forth. And at the same time, they also wield the laws and the authority in order to make sure that work is being done in accordance with the national and international standards and regulations that are set. You'll know that in many other sectors like telecommunications and other parts of the economy, there has been a move in the last 40 years to break the kind of monopolistic role that agencies have to be both regulators and operators, and we find that it works better as a whole that governments take on the task as regulators, and we open the market to operators, whether they're private sector companies or other types of community enterprises or social enterprises, to get on with the work. And the government's role is to make sure that this work is done in accordance with the necessary standards, laws, and regulations. And in that case, this perennial concern about, oh, we have too little staff and we have too little money is going to be solved, because instead of having to do the excavation yourself and then make sure the province is also doing its work correctly and the local authorities are doing their work correctly, then you can have the heritage agencies in charge of regulation rather than wearing both hats. And then finally, we see that in many cases, and increasingly more and more actually, heritage governance is quite fragmented. And it's fragmented in different ways. And so there's overlapping authorities between state and provincial and local and community levels. But there's also an essential fragmentation that happens in the nature and the structure of heritage laws and regulations in many cases, where you have built heritage dealt with under one set of laws, intangible heritage under another set of laws, cultural landscapes under another set of laws, and so forth. And in one sense, this is a kind of, it's a historical phenomenon, right? So many of the earliest laws dealt with archaeology and monuments. And then over time, as people's understanding of heritage grew, then they said, oh, well, we need to have a law for this, and we need to have a law for that. So in some cases, new laws were promulgated. And in other cases, over time, these laws may have been combined into one kind of omnibus heritage law. And I think, there's no clear indication that one model is necessarily better than the other model. But what is certainly clear is that when you do have separate laws being wielded by separate departments and government divisions and sets of bureaucrats doing things, then it does mean that on the ground, in a place where there is no clear line between what is built heritage and what is living heritage and so forth, you begin to have these artificial divisions take place. And this is perhaps neither optimal in terms of efficiency, but also not optimal in terms of either heritage conservation outcomes or in terms of development outcomes. And then finally, and this is maybe even more fundamental, is the fact that heritage laws and regulations are, by their nature, designed to protect heritage. And they're not designed to support local development objectives. But more and more, whether it's through the 2030 agenda with the sustainable goals or with other types of international and regional movements, and even very local movements from communities, there is a cry that heritage and development should go together. But the laws as they exist now, and as they're set up to regulate the work that is done by heritage people, is just about protection. And so the question now is, as our understanding of heritage and the role of heritage is expanding more and more, how do we ensure that our legal structures, our regulatory structures, and our administrative structures also expand as well? We have seen a movement in the last 40, 50 years from an understanding within the heritage world, and as enforced and kind of concretized by heritage law and regulations, that the work of heritage is to defend heritage islands that are populated by monuments and archaeological sites. And this is what we've seen from the Venice Charter onwards from the 1960s. Now, in the 90s, you know, with the NARA document and eventually with the emergence of the 2003 Intangible Heritage Convention, there has been more and more acknowledgement of the role of living heritage and the necessity to open up to other voices beyond just heritage experts. And so that in this way, we can see the kind of the spectrum of cultural heritage as being something that is not only worthy of protection, which is the main focus now. And you'll see that whether it's heritage objects or heritage sites, or underwater cultural heritage or intangible cultural heritage, this is kind of the focus of the law today. So even in the UNESCO international statutory instruments, which are the conventions, we have the 1970 convention, which focuses on the prevention of illicit trafficking, the 1972 convention, which looks at the protection of World Heritage Sites, the 2001 convention, which deals with underwater cultural heritage, and then the 2003 convention, which encourages the safeguarding of intangible cultural heritage. And at a national level, you'll see this play out as well. But increasingly, you're beginning to see that many countries are taking an approach towards the heritage law, which begins to include various forms of heritage under single laws. So in Indonesia, for instance, you have law number 11 concerning cultural conservation, which explicitly says that it is focused on tangible heritage conservation. But it's interesting that this definition extends beyond buildings and so forth to also include cultural landscapes. And you know that Bali, for instance, was included as a World Heritage Site precisely as a cultural landscape. At the same time, Indonesia does not yet have a national law specifically on intangible cultural heritage. When you move to China, you'll see that the 1982 law on tangible cultural heritage, which is the Cultural Relics Protection Law, in fact spans the gamut between objects, sites, and explicitly talks about underwater cultural heritage. And at the same time, in 2011, another law was promulgated specifically to look at intangible cultural heritage. And then if you take the case of Korea, the 1962 Cultural Heritage Protection Act has now been expanded to include all forms of heritage that are cultural heritage. And very interestingly, it also includes natural heritage. And in this way, it echoes the World Heritage Convention, which was very forward thinking at the time because it includes both cultural as well as natural heritage under the banner of a single law. And in this way, it provides a kind of holistic approach to looking at heritage beyond just putting things into silos. And so, but the challenge that faces us is moving beyond heritage protection and then thinking about how to mobilize heritage for sustainable development. A lot of people have talked about this. A lot of policies are emerging about this. But if you look at the letter of the law, it is not yet there. A lot of laws talk about the role of heritage for the enjoyment of the people and so forth, but very few laws make an explicit linkage between heritage and sustainable development, which, as the COVID pandemic shows us, is really the only way that we can sustain heritage in the future. If you think about heritage protection as the main job of heritage people, but you're not explicitly talking about heritage can benefit local communities and their well-being, you will see the incidents that I opened the presentation with in terms of poaching and looting and other manifestations of the fact that people feel like they have to exploit their heritage, perhaps in illegal ways in order to gain any benefits. Otherwise, there's, they don't receive any direct positive impacts from heritage protection. So we really need to move beyond heritage protection, and it's not just in our operational work or in our kind of policy making work, but we may need to go back and look at the law itself and see whether the law has possibilities for that. If you look at the international statutory world, you notice that, in fact, whether it's the World Heritage Convention or other conventions that UNESCO has put forward, like the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention, there is already a movement towards sustainable development. And for instance, a policy document was issued on the integration of a sustainable development perspective in the processes of the World Heritage Convention in 2015. And similarly, for intangible cultural heritage, a toolbox has been created, which offers a series of best practices as well as good case studies for how various countries and places have made this connection. But it is, in fact, kind of an add-on to the existing conventions as they exist. And if you look at the nature of heritage laws, whether it's in this region or really worldwide, many of them were rooted in antiquities laws. So if you look at, for instance, the Thai Act on Ancient Monuments, Antiques, Objects of Art and National Museums that was first drawn up in 1961 and subsequently revised, the wording is along these lines, right? No person shall repair, modify, alter, demolish, add to, destroy, remove any ancient monument or its parts, so on and so forth, except by order of the Director General. And so, first of all, there is a long list of prohibitions, and it vests the authority for the protection of heritage in the Director General of the Fine Arts Department, and so in a government entity, who then authorizes, his staff to be able to use the authority of this law to protect heritage sites. And then, how do we move to our sustainability aspirations? So it's interesting, for instance, here's an example from a law that emerged 50 years after this earlier antiquities law, in this case in China. So in the Intangible Cultural Heritage Law in China explicitly says that the state encourages and supports the leveraging of special advantages of intangible cultural heritage resources, with a view towards market potential. And so there's this idea that you can, in fact, use heritage in a generative way and to move beyond simply protection or safeguarding as the key kind of point of heritage work. And so perhaps this pandemic and a lot of the soul searching that has been initiated as a result of the pandemic will help us move towards more integrated legal and regulatory frameworks for heritage. And by integration, I mean integration in a number of ways. So first, can we move beyond safeguarding different silos of heritage towards a more holistic view of heritage? And on the one hand, we can talk about holistic, but if you look at your suite of laws and they're all putting things into boxes and then giving that to different people in the government, then I think it's going to be very difficult really to enact, a holistic implementation approach. Secondly, there's also this movement away from defending heritage towards mobilizing heritage towards sustainable local development. And once again, is there a place in the legal and regulatory framework to make that more explicit? Third, there's also a necessity, more so than ever, where we move beyond government agencies and specialists and give a legal role to customary guardians. For instance, in Myanmar, which recently overhauled its natural protected area legislation a couple years ago, this new legislation now has a role for customary guardians and a recognition of customary rights, which is actually very forward-thinking and I think quite progressive. And then finally, going back to the point about heritage agencies as operators and regulators, a lot of people are now talking in other sectors about the role of government as facilitators. And so lean government agencies are not going to be burdened with doing all the work on the ground themselves, but they're facilitating the private sector, communities, social enterprises and so forth in doing, actual work. And so this could be where we're moving to in the future. But at the end of the day, there needs to be a legal basis for doing all of this. And so when we begin to integrate a sustainability mindset into heritage practice, I want to leave you with one final set of slides, which is UNESCO has developed a new competence framework for cultural heritage management, which defines competencies across different areas, including managerial competencies, specialized technical competencies, personal competencies, but also most importantly, what we call core competencies. And in these core competencies, we say that, yes, there is the importance for heritage people to be able to apply laws and regulations. That is sort of, that is the basis for the work that we do. There's also an importance that we be able to develop and apply heritage policy principles, processes, and to demonstrate ethics. But the third is that part of our toolkit of skills and knowledge that everyone has to have in working in this field is an understanding of how to work with communities, how to valorize their rights and their knowledge. So it's not like some fringe activity you do at the end, to do like a community consultation, but it really needs to be built in, from the beginning of the process. Fourth, we're saying that heritage education and interpretation are central to the tasks of heritage people, and you need to be able to do this. And then finally, we're saying that sustainable development should be part and parcel of the work that we do, and it should be built into the very core competencies that we have. And so, for instance, even in the definition of specific skills and knowledge under the area of applying laws and regulations, if you look, one of these specific things we make mention of under ALR 2.2 is the ability to work with local communities to prevent illicit activities. And then similarly, when it comes to the realm of sustainable development, where we're defining what are the skills and knowledge people have in this area vis-a-vis heritage work, we're also saying that people need to be able to explicitly develop plans and projects that contribute to sustainable heritage management, as well as sustainable development in a local context. And part of this is making use of traditional resources and traditional knowledge as well. And so I'd like to encourage people who are joining us today from home or from your offices to look into this new course that we've just launched. Actually, it's on sustainable heritage management. And this will close on the 26th of October. It's aimed at people who work in the heritage world, but also with heritage people as well. And our poster, as you can see, are these dinosaurs escaping from this crystal palace. And it's a kind of a visual metaphor about how we need to move beyond the work of heritage that is rooted really sort of in the Victorian era, where heritage was seen as putting interesting curiosities into glass boxes and then preserving them in these glass boxes. And I think what we're trying to advocate for is how do you liberate the heritage and then make it part of the kind of social fabric and the ecological fabric and the economic activities of our communities, so that heritage really has a place in making our lives more meaningful, but also more sustainable. So with that, I'd leave you. I've taken, I think, maybe a little bit too much time, but I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Montira. That was a really great presentation and many useful points. In fact, we probably could run a whole 3-day conference based on the themes that you have elicited in your presentation. So maybe we can talk about that some other time. Jack, the floor is now yours, but in the meantime, can I please ask the audience to get your questions coming in? Those of you who joined us later, use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen and type your questions. You can either direct them to the panel at large or to anyone individually. All right, thank you. Jack, the floor is yours.
So today what I'm going to do is talk about love for heritage in the time of COVID-19, pandemics and preparedness. So what I'm going to talk about is how are tangible and intangible heritage affected by a pandemic. For tangible cultural heritage, we will be looking at art galleries, museums, and the artifacts they hold, as well as some outdoor heritage sites. And for intangible cultural heritage, we will consider some of the practitioners of ICH, such as artists and performers. And then we will look briefly at what law and public policy can do to support pre-pandemic planning and preparedness, procedures during a pandemic shutdown, and maybe some post-pandemic shutdown recovery. You'll see that most of the focus will be on pre-pandemic planning because hopefully now that we have had this experience for almost 8 months now, we are in a position to plan more and not have to react during a shutdown itself. Okay, so very, very brief timeline. As I said, it's already been about 8 months, but the first cluster of cases was reported by China back in December of last year. This is when there were a number of viral pneumonia cases of, at that time, an unknown cause, apparently originating in Wuhan, that were reported to the WHO. Singapore itself detected its first case in January, and this was a female national from China who had traveled to Wuhan, and she presented in Singapore with pneumonia. In March of this year, the WHO declared COVID-19 to be a pandemic. And in Singapore, with effect from the 23rd of March, all short-term visitors were banned from entering Singapore, which meant tourism basically ground to a halt. Between April and June, Singapore entered a circuit breaker or lockdown period. All non-essential workplaces, places of worship, schools, and importantly for our purposes, museums and other cultural and heritage institutions and restaurants were all closed. And during this period, people were required to stay home most of the time and to wear face masks as they had to venture out. Also, we began to see a different wave of infections in Singapore. So starting from April, most of the new infections were actually among the foreign worker community, mostly those in the construction industry and living in dormitories. But things have improved. From the beginning of June, the circuit breaker period was ended. Restrictions started to be eased. Museums were allowed to open at the end of June. And as of now, 5th of October, Monday, there were about 57,792 people diagnosed positive with the COVID-19. Most of them have been discharged. There are about 195 active cases, and there have been 27 deaths. Globally, of course, the WHO has now reported that over 34.8 million people have been diagnosed as positive, and the number of deaths recently exceeded 1 million. So it's still a serious problem. So what is the impact that all this has on heritage? Well, on tangible cultural heritage, obviously, as has been mentioned by the other speakers, artifacts in galleries, museums, and other heritage sites, which are closed, may be vulnerable to damage in various ways: excessive light, humidity, fire, water leakage, insect and rodent infestation, and maybe even vandalism and theft. Similarly, if you've got an open air heritage site, it's vulnerable to damage and vandalism and even looting because resources are being diverted elsewhere. No one is looking out for it, perhaps. Without local visitors and tourists, some heritage institutions may become bankrupt and close permanently. And state institutions may have their budgets cut so that public funds are diverted to healthcare and economic support. And this will obviously have an impact on how effectively institutions can safeguard their collections, continue their work, or support ICH practitioners. As for intangible cultural heritage, ICH will be impacted by restrictions on gathering, cancellation of cultural events, rituals of a religious nature, and traditional festivals. And as a result, ICH practitioners may have a greatly reduced income, and some may even choose to give up their heritage activities permanently, which will then result in a loss of ICH. So I'm going to talk now about pre-pandemic planning and preparedness. So there are, of course, a number of things that museums and cultural institutions should consider. And I'm going to group them very loosely into some things which I consider as essential and some things which are nice to have, but maybe not so essential. And of course, the first thing is, has the institution in question worked out a pandemic protocol? Now that, again, we're 8 months into this, a number of different countries have come up with guides, and these are available online. I've just put some examples on the screen. But these are the sorts of things that institutions will need to think about. Which are the staff which can work from home and which will need to continue physically going into the institution? For example, security guards may need to be there on the ground to make sure that the institution, its premises are safe. Conservators may have to go in because they are working on things which are delicate and they can't just stop in the middle of it. They may have to continue their work. Then if you've got people still physically going into the institution, there's the question of whether there's enough personal protective equipment for these people. Where are you going to get your supply from? This costs money, and this is so on. What are the contingency plans of the organization for continuing with work if some of the staff actually fall ill or need to care for people who are ill? And very importantly, is there a proper inventory of artifacts that's held by the institution? And can this inventory be accessed remotely, for example, online, if most people are working from home and the institution is shut down? So obviously an inventory is very vital to ensure that damaged or stolen artifacts can be quickly identified. And you will see that this is stressed in some of the conventions that I will mention later. Does the institution have adequate safeguards against risks that may occur during the shutdown period? So as we have pointed out, there are risks such as excessive light, humidity, which can lead to mold growth, fire and water leakage, insect and rodent infestation, and you will need to have some sort of closed circuit television, security alarms, which are accessible remotely to guard against break-ins and vandalism. This is an article about pests that have been running amok in US, UK museums, which are during lockdown. And then maybe there are some things which are arguably maybe not essential, although this is debatable, but certainly very desirable to have. In a time when people are mostly confined at home, how can the institution continue to be a learning and cultural resource and to support ICH practitioners? And I'll say a little bit more about this later on. And are there laws that will aid in the recovery of items which unfortunately have been stolen and illegally imported? And this is what I'm going to talk about a little bit now. So Singapore itself has yet to become a state party to two important conventions in this area. The 1970 UNESCO Convention, which relates to the illicit import, export, and transfer of and ownership of cultural property, and the 1995 UNIDROIT Convention on stolen or illegally exported cultural objects. Quite a number of countries, especially the 1970 Convention, quite a number of countries are now members of the 1970 Convention. So a member of the 1970 Convention is required, among other things, to have laws that secure the protection of the cultural heritage and particularly prevention of illicit import, export, and transfer of ownership of important cultural property, and to keep a list of important public and private cultural property whose export would constitute appreciable impoverishment of the natural cultural heritage. So this is a convention that stresses the importance of heritage institutions having an inventory of the important cultural artifacts that they hold. And if Singapore were to become a party to this convention, it would be required to do the following. For example, it would have to introduce a licensing scheme for the export of cultural property. It would have to make sure that its museums don't acquire illegally exported cultural property, and it would have to prohibit the import of stolen cultural property. And if such property has been imported and the state of origin requests, it has to take steps to recover and return this property. And this is subject to the payment of some just compensation to any innocent purchaser who has valid title to the property by the requesting state. Singapore could also follow the UK's example. When the UK became a party to the 1970 Convention, it enacted the Dealing in Cultural Objects Offences Act. And this makes it an offense to dishonestly deal in a cultural object that is tainted, knowing or believing that the object is tainted. And a cultural object is considered as tainted if, among other things, it has been removed from a building or structure of historical, architectural, and archaeological interest, of which it had formed a part, and such removal is an offense. And what is interesting is that this removal doesn't have to take place in the UK. It can take place in a foreign country under a foreign law, and it will still be an offense in the UK. So it's meant to protect against people illegally removing objects from foreign countries and then trying to import them and either sell them in the UK or transship them from the UK onto third countries. The 1995 UNIDROIT Convention also provides for the return of stolen and illegally exported cultural objects, but the main difference, I think, between it and the 1970 Convention is that while the 1970 Convention only applies to governments of state parties, the 1995 UNIDROIT Convention allows individuals to bring court cases for the return of stolen cultural objects from people who are in possession of these objects. So it has already been noted by some groups, in particular the Antiquities, Trafficking and Heritage Anthropology Research Project, that even as countries went into COVID-19 lockdowns, there was an increase in posts in Facebook groups involved in buying and selling looted objects from the Middle East and North Africa. So it seems that people are taking advantage of the time when national focus is diverted to battling the pandemic to trying to see what benefit can be obtained from cultural heritage sites which are not being well guarded and safeguarded. This next picture is actually taken from one such website which appeared in this article by the ATA project. And it shows a Facebook post offering a child mummy that has been unearthed somewhere in the Middle East for sale. So this is definitely going on. It's not sort of, the looters have not taken a break during this period. And unfortunately, there is some anecdotal evidence that Singapore is a transit and distribution center for cultural property that is looted from other Asian countries around the region, such as Cambodia, China, Indonesia, and Myanmar. And in 2015, the Asian Civilizations Museum had to return an 11th century Uma Parameshwari bronze statue, which was bought for some $650,000 to Indian authorities. It was bought through a dealer. It turned out later that the dealer appeared to have been dealing in stolen goods. And this particular sculpture was apparently stolen from a temple in Tamil Nadu in India. And so it had to be returned to the authorities in India. So arguably, Singapore would be acting as a responsible global citizen if it decides and accepts these treaties. On the one hand, it will be helping source nations, which are often developing nations, to recover illegally exported cultural property, including those stolen during such times as this pandemic, when attention is diverted. And you could also say that it would also benefit Singapore, because obviously, if anything was stolen from Singapore and exported illegally out of Singapore, there would be some means for Singapore to then ask the countries to which the object has been exported to also try and recover the item. So it's a reciprocal thing, although in this case, it is likely that Singapore would not be a source country in this case for many situations. But Singapore would also be fulfilling its obligation under Article 10 of the 2000 ASEAN Declaration on Cultural Heritage, which requires ASEAN member countries to exert the utmost effort to protect cultural property against theft, illicit trade, and trafficking and illegal transfer, and to cooperate to return, seek the return, or help to facilitate the return to their rightful owners of cultural property that has been stolen from a museum, site, or similar repositories. Okay, now I'm going to say more briefly something about what happens during a pandemic shutdown. I think one important point to make is that hopefully heritage should be seen as part of a government's pandemic response, because it is a learning resource and it also helps to build community resilience. And therefore, public servants in the heritage sector should be included in the government's pandemic task force so that they are aware of any shutdown and reopening measures and can make plans. And in order to support public and private heritage institutions and ICH practitioners, where possible, grants or some types of funding should be made available. And the law can provide also for temporary protection against lawsuits for unpaid debts, rental relief, etc. In Singapore, this was implemented through the COVID-19 Temporary Measures Act of 2020 and subsidiary legislation issued under the Act. It's quite complicated, I'm not going to go through it, but just to point out that it would help greatly heritage institutions, which are especially in the private sector, individuals, if there was some sort of protection during this period when they have very little income. How then can state heritage agencies and museums support private institutions and ICH practitioners? Well, if conservation work is contracted out to the private sector, then perhaps these institutions can prioritize the continuation of conservation work to provide conservators with income. So even though the institution is shut down, the exhibitions are not going on, at least the background work can continue and provide some income to conservators. And thought can be given to providing funding for, or perhaps even to redeploy funds that would have been spent on exhibitions and public events that can no longer be held at this point in time, to the following: to engage ICH practitioners to produce digital content for education as well for enjoyment purposes. And ideally, some of this should actually be done during the ordinary times as part of pre-pandemic preparation rather than only when the pandemic happens. But also engaging people to digitize and otherwise document physical heritage items. And in Singapore, what has happened is that the National Art Council has made available a digital presentation grant for the arts, and the National Heritage Board has rolled out a digital project grant precisely to support activities of this sort. Other things that can be done are that online lectures and events using video conferencing software and video sharing and video streaming services can be held. For example, this year's Singapore Heritage Festival, which is usually an in-person festival, was held online. And obviously, government departments can encourage public donations to raise funds for ICH practitioners, perhaps encouraging this through some sort of dollar-for-dollar matching scheme and so on. And then post-pandemic, in the shutdown recovery, when reopening after a shutdown has been lifted, as the pandemic will most likely not have entirely ended, museums and heritage institutions will have to bear some of these things in mind. Obviously, all health advisories, precautions, such as limits on the number of visitors, safe distancing, recording of contact details, temperature checking, mask wearing, provision of hand sanitizer will have to be thought about. And when planning interactive exhibitions, and maybe even the redesign of buildings, it may be necessary to consider how touching of surfaces can be reduced, perhaps through more motion sensor and voice activation technology. And this is something which is pretty new to a lot of us, because in pre-pandemic times, this was not something that we really thought about. But now that we are aware that this sort of pandemic can happen, how do we redesign not just our exhibitions, our activities, but maybe even our working spaces, our living spaces, to try and prevent the spread of this sorts of disease. So it's a big area. Architects are beginning to look at this as well. And obviously, because the pandemic has not completely subsided, it will be a good idea for heritage institutions to continue to produce online content, organize online events, and so on. And ICH practitioners may still require financial assistance for a certain period after a full shutdown has been relaxed. So just some concluding thoughts about this very quick survey. Hopefully, heritage should not be seen as an optional extra during a pandemic. And as the ICCROM put it in its COVID-19 call for protecting heritage statement, culture and cultural heritage plays a significant role in providing social and post-trauma support, enabling social cohesion and the building of resilience of communities during times of crisis. So it is hoped that heritage institutions can continue to be an educational resource for students engaged in home-based learning, to support ICH practitioners who would otherwise have little or no income, and to provide heritage content that will build a sense of community and provide emotional support, which will help people confined at home during the pandemic to deal with a sense of dislocation and disorientation. All this is very well for a country that is fairly well off and has the resources to do this. And this is likely to be developed countries. But what about developing countries? They may have to channel most of their public finances towards healthcare and economic support during times like this. So where possible, governments and NGOs in developed countries should consider whether they can support developing countries by, for example, providing income for heritage institutions, either directly or through regional and international organizations such as UNESCO, providing advice and expertise, making the online content which they have already produced available to people from other countries. And also, again, coming back to this theme, having in place laws that provide for the return of illegally exported cultural heritage back to these source countries. So that's a very quick summary of the kinds of issues and things that need to be thought about during times of pandemics. And I hope you found that useful. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jack, for a very comprehensive presentation. We now move to the Q&A segment. We've got about 5 minutes left, but so far there's only one question, and that's directed to Montira. This is from our good friend Prof. Yeo Kang Shua, who is the current president of ICOMOS Singapore. He says, thank you very much for your presentation. The conflict between legal custodians and customary guardians have been a long-standing issue which you have described. The pandemic has brought this issue out to the forefront. There have been attempts to co-opt customary guardians into and be part of the legal mechanism. Is such a model still valid? Or do we need a complete rethink of the model? What could a new model be? Is the Myanmar example a case of co-opting, or is it more than that? Are you able to elaborate? Thank you.
Thanks to Kang Shua for the question. This question makes me think about, questions about like legal reform or other types of reform. For instance, this whole Black Lives Matter. There's a lot of discussion now in Minneapolis that it is not possible to reform the existing policing mechanisms and structures in Minneapolis. And they just have to start from scratch. Like they have to completely overhaul the system. And I think, the heritage mechanisms are maybe equally entrenched, right? And in many ways, they're equally disempowering. And there's a lot of injustice built into heritage laws, quite frankly, and then authorities and bureaucracies. And so, it depends if you're an optimist or a pessimist. I don't know if it's possible to take gradual efforts to reform the existing law, or like the Myanmar case, it was a new law that came up, and it was, built up from scratch, and it went through an impressive number of consultations around the country. And I think it has a very kind of, I think quite a sincere approach to including communities who live in forest protected areas to have more of a stake in this. I mean, I think, the power gradient will always continue to be there, but at least making this opening in the letter of the law itself, I think is more than just gestural. I think it's really significant. And I think if this kind of spirit of inclusiveness can be reflected in other laws as they're reformed or as they're redrawn up, I think that's important. And we'll see actually that heritage law, in some cases, they're very entrenched, like they just continue to tweak bits and pieces here and there. But in a lot of cases, many countries have totally issued new heritage laws, right? So Malaysia did, Laos did, a lot of countries. So it is not impossible to think that when a new evolution of heritage law is drawn up, that these things will be codified in place as part of, kind of basic, kind of the framework of doing things. And I think more and more, I think it's harder to co-opt people because people are vocal and they're out there and they have many ways of being heard. And so it's not like in the old days where you could just, kind of waylay them on the side of the road somewhere. So now, people have Twitter and they have this and they have that. So it's not going to be so easy, So I think we need to rethink these things. And I think, this is an interesting project that maybe if ICOMOS would like to take on here in the region to think about some of this kind of structural reform issues beyond, heritage, and taking into account both things that Paulius brought up as well as Jack brought up. I think this would be kind of a very, very timely moment to consider working together on that front.
Thank you. My mistake, we have till 12:30, so please keep your questions coming in. And we'll try and answer them. A question for Jack from Rizwana. We usually think of cultural practitioners as experts, institutions, and so on. You mentioned students being involved in cultural, in heritage activities. How do we empower them to think of heritage as being part of their lives as well?
Rizwana is a fellow member of the Singapore Heritage Society, EXCO. So thanks, Rizwana, for your question. I think that it's clear from moves such as the introduction of the ICH Convention in 2003 that there's much more awareness now that heritage isn't really just about old things in museums that one pops in to look at, right? Heritage is really all around us. It is the way people live their lives. It is traditions and so on. And I think that now that there is much more recognition of this internationally and hopefully on the national basis as well, that we begin to impart this to young people, that heritage is really about learning about how your parents lived, your grandparents lived, but also how you live and the sorts of cultural activities that you participate in. And by building up this concept, then I think we get more people to appreciate how heritage is all around them and impacts them, and is precious to think about and to protect as well. So yeah, I think it's really been a shift in the last decades or so. It's a very recent thing, whereas in the past it was all about really old things that require protection.
Right. Thank you. Thanks, Jack. Maybe I'll take the prerogative of being the chair to ask Jack this specific question with regard to the 1970 convention. I mean, why do you think that Singapore, of all states in Southeast Asia, I mean, would resist, you know, signing on to a convention that, you know, from what we have seen, you know, appears to be having more pros than cons. It's more positive than negative, right?
Hard to say. I mean, I can only speculate at this point in time. Generally, Singapore has not had a very strong track record of signing on to heritage conventions as a whole.
Yes.
I guess in the beginning, it was not seen as a hugely important thing, and that, you know, economic development was prioritized and so on. And so it is only in recent years that we have started to sign on to more of these conventions. First, the World Heritage Convention, and then followed by the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention. So it could be down the road. And this is where the speculative part comes in. It could be that because Singapore is probably not going to be the main beneficiary of the convention, instead, it's going to be the one that everyone is going to make requests of for things to be returned, because generally Singapore is not a source country, right? It doesn't have the buried remains of temples, large statues that you take from archaeological sites. So really, we are going to be the ones who are going to face all the requests from other countries for the things we return. And this puts some administrative load on it. And I suppose maybe that is something that Singapore has thought, well, it's not really benefiting us directly in any particular way. And so maybe it's not been a high priority. But I think, I mean, it's good to point out that by signing on to it, essentially you're being a good global citizen. You are saying we want to play our role in making sure that the trade does not proliferate. And so we want to do our part for that. And of course, yes, there will be some benefit for us if, of course, it goes the other way. Someone steals something from Singapore and exports it illegally to another outside country. But I think at this point in time, we have to make the argument that it is really more about being a good global citizen, helping other countries and helping to stamp out the illicit trade as a whole. Because if you look at it from a purely beneficial point of view, then your chances are you're not going to be very convinced then.
True, and I think that sort of that question is something which Kang Shua is also asking, so I'm not going to re-ask that question. I mean, he's basically asking that actually he thinks that Singapore has already fulfilled her obligations in preventing illicit trade, right, under ASEAN. So what's stopping us, right? So I think that's also a sort of similar question.
Yeah.
But to all the panelists, let me ask this question, right? One of the biggest hurdles and challenges and that we have faced, you know, for the longest time has always been, how do we get, you know, the states of the world to recognize heritage as being really, really crucial to, you know, beyond just sort of income generating things, right? I mean, how do we prioritize this to the extent that, you know, during a time of pandemic, I mean, in an emergency, you've got to take care of all the economic problems and so on, but you've got to ensure that at least things don't get destroyed, things don't get looted. I mean, you know that's the basic. We're not even asking for promotion. We're not even asking for, you know, any form of kind of promotion or things like that. What can we do? Yes, Paul, please.
I think I probably might not answer this question, but share some thoughts that we have in the debate on COVID. So we have identified before sending out the questionnaire, and also in some of the responses, we had the same thought that heritage is beyond this either local site that is closely tied to the community or source of revenue from tourism or any activities related to the site or the event or the object. The idea here was that during these times that are extremely challenging, unprecedented, heritage becomes this kind of a glue or a bonding tool that helps people come together, see hope, and feel that there is purpose and bring some joy and happiness. So a really high level concept, but I think it moves from this very, transactional relationship into more personal, intergenerational relationship and perspective to heritage. And I think I would like to maybe use this opportunity, because we're running out of time. The other question I think that somehow has been touched upon by all three speakers, right? We have also a challenging task now in terms of dealing with heritage related problems that are present regardless of COVID. I think Montira's presentation really touches upon these fundamental issues and where are we moving? What is the better way to move forward? And whether COVID time could help us actually not only to deal with COVID specific problems, but also address more fundamental problems in terms of management and the better allocation of resources. Sorry, monologue.
No, that's great. Thank you. Any other thoughts, Montira or Jack?
Well, yeah, I thought of, as Paul has just mentioned, I think we realized through this pandemic that heritage isn't just a tourism thing, because when the tourism stops, then what is the purpose of these, of our heritage sites, of our heritage practices and so on? And I think we have to come back to this key point that it is really the identity of the people here, and we need to emphasize and stress those things. Yeah.
Right.
Maybe just quickly to share that, the Sustainable Development Goals for the first time included heritage as an explicit part of the goals, as everyone knows, right, under 11.4. But they're also cross-linkages against many of the other goals related to decent work and life on land and life on water and so forth. I just sent everybody a link to a recent report that was issued that looked at how countries are reporting on their fulfillment of the Sustainable Development Goals, looking at the specific issue of culture and heritage and how they are responding on that. And I think it's a bit of encouragement to see that, I think, despite the general sense that countries are not paying attention to this, that in fact there are more and more countries looking at it, maybe still in a transactional way, but more and more so, I think, looking at also issues tied to cultural rights, which I think it is more fundamental and less transactional, and issues tied to healthy environment and so forth. And so sort of well-being in a broader way, and how heritage is kind of an essential building block of that. So feel free to check that out. That link.
Thanks very much, Montira. Yes, it looks very interesting. We'll check it out afterwards. Maybe I could ask all three panelists about this, a point which actually has been raised by all of you in sort of different ways, and that is this move to digital, right? You can't go to a museum, we go digital. You can't see a real artwork, we go digital. And digital is also where our young people actually spend a lot of time on. And do you not see this as a major challenge? Now, yes, we can argue that there's lack of authenticity. I mean, it's not the same as seeing the real object. It's not the same as being there, feeling the place, and experiencing a ritual or what have you. But do you not then see that one of the biggest challenges that's posed by this pandemic and our run to alternatives to deal with this may in fact create a bigger problem of engagement with the younger community down the line?
Maybe just to jump in quickly about this. I mean, I think digitization, no, digital transformation has been accelerated by the pandemic. Everyone has talked about this, and I think from a legal and maybe financial perspective, there are still two challenges to be overcome. One is the issue of IP. I think a lot of cultural and art practitioners have a very hazy understanding of IP, and in a way that benefits them, but also in a way that protects, things that are maybe common heritage and etc. So that's something that we need to work on as a heritage community. Secondly, is the issue of monetizing digital access. It's well and good to let everybody in and look at stuff for free, and that serves definitely educational purposes, which is in a way the bedrock of what art and culture institutions are set up for. But at the end of the day, if digital platforms are replacing bricks and mortar, people need to be able to monetize this. And it's not just the producer, but it's also the cultural institutions that are the intermediaries, like the galleries, the museums, and so forth. But it's also the communities who live around and maybe were benefiting from souvenir sales and whatnot. So how do they get a piece of that pie? That's the issue. But it's interesting, in several roundtables that I've taken part in, there's also an issue of digital lashback, like sort of people are all zoomed out and they, don't want to do any more of these online type things. Too much digital, content is actually making people, it's feeding a hunger for real things.
Yes.
We see that, like the price of digital cameras is now cheaper than like film cameras, right? And so film cameras have become a luxury item, and it's impossible to get film developed, right? So it's very specialist now. So maybe, it's not going to be linear. It's going to be circular.
It strikes me that, like a lot of things in life, the use of digital media is a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, yes, I mean, it's a way of perhaps reaching people who would not step into a heritage institution. It's reaching out to people from an international audience. But on the other hand, I don't think it can replace the genuine thing. It engenders an idea that everything is free, and that if it's not free, I don't want it. And I'm not sure that's a sustainable thing as well. And yeah, it's just the experience is different. So I think it's helpful, it's supportive, but it really shouldn't, and we shouldn't try and assume that it can replace actual heritage and visiting heritage sites and seeing things in person. Yeah.
Right. Paul, any last thoughts?
I think we have one of these common themes in our national committee reports was this digitization, and I think there are pros and cons. It's really hard now to make a general statement, because yes, it's good. As I mentioned, many people are able to join, but it becomes really cold and not really authentic. So much more, I think, thought should be given to that.
Okay, well, thank you very much, all of you. I mean, just speaking for myself, actually, the more I see this digital content, the more I feel I need to be there and actually experience it in real life. But maybe that's a function of age as well, right? But I want to thank all our speakers today, Paul, Montira, and Jack, for joining us and giving us a really inspiring and interesting talk about the challenges that we are facing. And I think a lot of food for thought. I'm really quite serious about maybe working with Montira and UNESCO and see whether we can work something out on looking at the how we can talk more about changing the structural impediments that inhibit the sort of a reform in heritage protection and law. And so on behalf of the Center for Advanced Legal Studies, as well as from ICOMOS Singapore, I thank all our audience for joining us, and I hope you found this as interesting as I did. Thank you, everybody.